Okay, mic check, 1, 2, 1, 2. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, Nick, we're gonna get this going. So if everyone wants to take their seats. All right, for those of you who are watching us live, welcome to the SIA Convention, New York. Right now we're running a little bit late on getting our first guest, Maia, going, but we had some technical difficulties, but we got that all fleshed out now. So while folks are coming in and filling in, I am going to take a little bit of time to thank some of our sponsors for their participation in our convention this year. TMI and partners with all the travel vouchers and the travel certificates. One, thank you. Zombie Blast for hooking us up with the zombie shots. Also, NYC Zombie Crawl for helping us out with the zombies for our demonstration in Times Square. That was a lot of fun yesterday. We even had some little kids coming down. It was awesome. So, Addie, and if you girls want to come and take your seats, we're going to get started here in a second. Why don't you, Maia, why don't you come and sit here because this is, yeah, sit.
All right. Are you going to come and join me because you're going to interview me? Only in the little brother? I'm finding the question. Okay. I know.
What is the frame here? The most important thing is what we capture. So we want this to look like Maia's a big deal, guys.
No, you really are. Yeah.
Well, Maia really is a big deal.
I follow you on Twitter. Cool.
Hey, Addie, you mind sitting here?
Let's get everyone. Sit right here. We're going on that one.
Julie, why don't you move one up? Yeah, because like the front row right there. Excellent.
Let's get someone next to Alex.
Julie, you mind sitting right there? Okay.
You have that incredible back. Your hair looks phenomenal.
Thank you. Look at him. He's working it, isn't he?
All right.
Oy.
So, Nick,
That-
are you working on a documentary or something here?
You know what? None of this has anything to do with me. I just jumped in here.
Because you're a director by nature.
Yeah.
Let's make that happen.
Just trying to lend a helping hand.
All right.
You find it? Oh, great.
You know, it's funny. I've been trying to get my wife. It was empty.
The glass didn't even break.
My documentary days are over.
I was wondering.
Yeah, no, it's not happening.
All right. We're
Session.
we're getting settled in there. We're good.
I like knowing when my shooting schedule is on. I'm fine with doing pickup shots or reshoots, but I like to know when the shoot is over.
All right. I think we're all settled in, and we can get this bad boy started. All right. So grab your waters, get your pens, pads ready. All you folks out there in Streamland, welcome. Thanks for being patient and just working with us. Sometimes we got some technical difficulties, but if we just stay to it, we'll flush them all out. We did, and we're getting a little bit of a late start. It was worth capturing because what Maia has to say is extremely important, and it's worth streaming. So we wanted to take the extra time to work out all the glitches, so sorry for the delay. I'm Steve Kimbrough, your host and MC of the New York Convention, and AKA the Pod Brother. And it's been my pleasure to work with Jody and coordinating the AV and the media and, just doing everything I can to make the conference work smoothly. And I am not going to waste any more time. I just want to get right straight to it. So at this time, I would like to introduce Jody Hobbs, the president of the SIA organization, and she's going to introduce Maia, and we're going to really kick off. You can stay there. You're in shot. Yeah. Jody Hobbs, so you know.
First of all, I want to thank everybody for attending, and those of you who are on the live stream, thanks so much for tuning in. Maia is an amazing, phenomenal woman, and I'm going to let you tell her her background and what she specializes in. But I love this lady. She's a hero to me, and I am just so honored to be here and listen and gain more knowledge and experience from her. Maia?
Thank you so much, and I'm really delighted and honored to be here as well. I could not, have done the work I do without the survivors whose stories I've been, fortunate enough to try to tell. And that's, a lot of my work over the last 10 years or so has been looking at institutional abuse as it takes place in institutions like boot camps, so-called therapeutic boarding schools, so-called emotional growth schools, tough love programs, behavior modification programs, some psych hospitals, and just try to figure out where the idea came from that being cruel to people is going to help them. We don't think that abusing little kids is good for them, and I don't understand why we think abusing teenagers would fix them. So I wanted to investigate that, and my book, Help at Any Cost, How the Troubled Teen Industry Cons Parents and Hurts Kids, was the result of that work, and I continue to cover this whenever I can. I'm generally a health and science writer, and I focus on addiction a lot. So, these issues do come up. And I hope to, make parents and kids aware that this is just not the right thing to do. It doesn't help, it does hurt, and we actually have things that can help people, so we shouldn't be doing this nonsense.
So we're going to do kind of a Q&A where I'm asking questions to Maia, and she's going to answer. So my first question to you is, I know you've been documenting this for a very long time, so I'd like you to kind of fill me in on the history of
Sure.
Institutional child abuse.
Sure, and I'm starting with a particular form of institutional child abuse. There's been all kinds of it where we've had reform schools and, like the Magdalen laundries in Ireland, and we've had institutions where children are treated horribly for probably ever since there have been children and institutions. So the part where I pick up is where the abuse became the treatment, where the idea was that being tough was actually what helped, and that being tough was therapeutic. And that, at least in the addictions field, starts with a cult named Synanon. And Synanon started in the 50s, and it grew out of this idea by this failed stand-up comic who was an AA member, and he thought that AA would work better if the steps were forced, and if people were living communally to work together to, supposedly help each other grow. And the idea was we start with, the first step, that you're powerless, and so therefore we make you powerless. And then we become your higher power, and we force you to confess, and we humiliate you instead of allowing you to find humility on your own. And basically, when you do this, it turns into a recipe for a cult. And it turns into all of the things that you've been speaking about here earlier about how to control people's minds and change their behaviors. This actually is not very good for long-term behavior change because it requires you staying in the group and continuing to be manipulated, but it does, in the short term, produce compliance. So Synanon is where this starts, and we then go to, at least in, well, Synanon spreads. Synanon basically was the first organization to claim to have produced a cure for heroin addiction. And at that time, it was believed that heroin addiction was untreatable. In fact, about 15% of people sort of naturally age out of it at any given time. So what Synanon was actually doing was by treating everybody so intensely lousily that only the most committed people stayed, you were getting those 15% and throwing everybody else out. So it looked like it worked. And so states around the country began sending people to California, where it was based, to find out this miracle thing, because everybody was really worried about heroin. And so New York State picked it up, and we got Phoenix House and Daytop, which are programs that still exist to this day. They actually, at least Phoenix House has, at least publicly and in terms of all its material, renounced this approach. And so while it may continue under sort of hazing-like things, it is not the official treatment there anymore. But as far as I know, Daytop has not renounced it, but I'm not sure. But there were hundreds of these organizations across the United States, and basically the entire public addiction treatment system that was not methadone consisted of these kinds of programs. And private treatment was basically 12-step. And a lot of that during the 80s became mixed in with this Synanon-style stuff. So virtually, if you went to addiction treatment in the 80s or 90s, you were going to get some of this confrontation and humiliation, whether officially or not. So the other thing that happened in the 80s and 90s was there were sort of varieties of this that spread, some of it directly from Synanon and some of it indirectly through other organizations that sort of came to the same idea. But so you get chains like, well, what ended up being Aspen, you get WASP, you get, so Synanon inspires another failed stand-up comic to start The Seed, and that grows in Florida until there's congressional hearings in 1974, which compare it to North Korean brainwashing. And so that is not exactly good for their PR. So they basically, Mel Sembler, who had sent his kid there and who is still active in Republican politics today and still active in anti-marijuana politics today, he says, you know, this is a wonderful program, we can't have it shut down, so let's just change the name and we'll start all over again. And actually, that was the origin of Straight. And Straight, over the course of from like the 70s through the early 90s, says that it treated 50,000 people. And Straight then begat Kids, and Kids another 5,000 or 10,000 or so. You know, so this was not a tiny thing. And we also get these other, you know, WASP probably treated 10,000 people. That was the Worldwide Association of Specialty Programs in Schools. I think they may actually be closed now. It's hard to tell entirely, but Cross Creek Manor is gone apparently, and virtually all, like Spring Creek Lodge is gone. Like it's quite astonishing. They seem to still have something and maybe they have something in Costa Rica or something like that. But actually, Costa Rica got shut down, I think, for a third time. And so anyway, so there's, there are, the other thing that's peculiar about this is that it was not really defined sort of as a coherent problem until I wrote that book. And what I did there was put together the tough love ideology that was sort of common to things like boot camps, to these emotional growth boarding schools like WASP ran, the ones that Aspen runs, and sort of put it all together under the umbrella of tough love and the idea that, abuse is going to fix this. Because before that, there would be investigations that would be like, here's a horrible program, or first it'd be, here's a controversial program. Jane says it's fabulous, Joe says it sucks. And that was how it got covered at first. Then the controversy would build and build and build, and finally it'd be like, this is a horrible thing, we have to shut it down, etc. So there were also, because these things grew up under different names and with different styles, there was also no regulation on a lot of it. And so a program could move from state to state. There's also a whole thread that I didn't really get into that much in Help at Any Cost, but that is, there's just as many chains of these, which are the Christian ones, which I think the film Kidnapped for Christ goes into. So there is, there's this whole strain, basically, in American so-called therapy for teenagers, which involves attacking them and destroying their identities in order to supposedly fix them and rebuild them. So hopefully that's a brief historical introduction.
Okay. The next question is there any laws or regulation for institutions to protect the children?
So this is where it gets a little bit complicated. If you run a psychiatric institution, there are definite regulations and laws that you have to follow. These may not always be followed, but they do exist. And if you're not allowed to use restraint for punishment, you have to have a certain amount of training, you have to have a certain amount of staff. All of this stuff is the case in psychiatric institutions. But if you run a so-called program and you say, let's say it's an emotional growth boarding school, you can basically do whatever the heck you want, especially if you're in the South where you're actually allowed to spank the kids and use corporal punishment. So these programs are basically less regulated than nail salons. And you can actually lock up a child with no appeal and keep them hostage until they are 18, and beat them, if you like, with impunity, as long as you call it a school. If you start to call it a drug treatment program, you might get some regulation under certain states' laws. You might need a license, but the thing with drug treatment in general is that the standards for counselors are really incredibly low. Some places you don't even need to have a high school degree. And so the licensing regimes are not so great for if you call yourself an addiction treatment place, but there is some regulation, and I don't think you're allowed to beat people in addiction treatment. Although if you call yourself a religious treatment, there's another set of regulations, and this varies by state. But there are no federal regulations about what you can do to kids in institutions that are meant to reform them but are not actually juvenile justice or psychiatric places. Yes, sorry.
A quick question on that. So do they have to call themselves the school, or they can call themselves a program?
They can, if you call yourself a wilderness program, you can. There are some states that have regulations for wilderness programs. Utah has regulations that look good on paper, but that are very rarely enforced. There's like one guy who supposedly oversees, 100 programs. So New York State actually, I think I heard that they closed this program, but Aspen had a wilderness program in New York State called, I think it was Adirondack Leadership, and New York State did not know that it existed. So I don't think New York State has any regulations for wilderness programs. So boot camp is another thing that these places call themselves, and there are really no regulations for that on a federal level. And some states may have it, but again, if there is regulation, it is almost never actually enforced.
Okay. The next question is, what are the instances in which residential treatment is actually effective?
So there actually isn't any data suggesting that residential treatment is good for anything. The reality, however, is that there are some people who are a serious danger to themselves or others, and they need to be in an institution where they can be cared for. With children, this tends to be extremely psychiatrically disturbed children, some people with severe forms of autism, and a lot of kids who've been through 20 foster homes and who really never had a chance to attach to their parents. So in those situations, there really isn't any alternative. And the consensus in the mental health world is basically now that institutional care should be used at an absolute minimum. If you have kids, those kids who've been in 20 foster homes or have severe psychiatric issues and just really can't live in a community setting, then you want to have the highest qualified staff, the least restrictive setting, and doing your best to try to get them into the community. Because nobody should have to live in a situation that is incredibly restrictive for no good reason. And it is not therapeutic to keep people out of the community when they can be in the community, basically.
So the parents, if this is the case and they need assistance, what are some of the red flags or signs that they look for to say whether this is an appropriate place or facility for their child?
Sure. So if your kid, there's also one other situation in which residential may be useful, and that is if you are addicted to the point of using every day. If you are using cocaine every day, if you're injecting anything, if you are using opioids every day or alcohol every day, these residential treatment that is focused on addiction can be useful in that circumstance. So what parents really need to look for is, first of all, is the place licensed? Second of all, what does my child actually have? If your child is, say, addicted, is this kid actually just binge drinking on weekends and smoking a bit of pot? Or is this kid injecting heroin? You don't want to put the kid who's binge drinking and smoking pot in with the heroin injectors. Otherwise, you're basically going to be taking your kid and putting him into the bad crowd that you were trying to avoid your kid hanging out with. So it's really important to think of the fact that these things can backfire. To find also one of the things that is a very good question for ferreting out abusive care is, when can my kid talk to me, and will that be supervised? If it will be supervised and there's restrictions on the kid talking to you, that is a big red flag. Another red flag is if they tell you that your child is going to lie to you, that you shouldn't believe your child, that they may make up bizarre reports of abuse, because obviously in that situation, nobody can report true accounts of abuse. So those are some of the red flags. I think, not having, you want to know who the staff are, and if the people that are working with the kids on a daily basis don't have at least a master's, that's a red flag. Of course, you probably wouldn't find a program that meets that standard anywhere, but ideally you want the highest qualified staff, and you really want to know what you're dealing with. Like, if a kid has Asperger's or a kid has addiction, those are very different conditions generally. I am one of the few people who probably qualifies for both, but this is not a usual combination, and you really want to know what you're dealing with. If there is no such diagnosis as troubled teen. And, for all the terrible things we can say about the DSM, which I think there's a meeting going on right now in the same hotel of the Psychiatric
There is.
Association. For all the terrible things we can say about the DSM, it's the best thing that we've got. And if somebody has depression, first of all, you really want to keep them home if at all possible. Because if you're depressed, the worst thing is to be sent away and be with strangers. You want love, care, support, and probably medication if if talk therapy isn't enough for you. So you really want to diagnose what's up and treat what's up, not just throw them into some random mix. Does that make sense? Yes.
Yeah, and also I wanted to point out, if some of the methods that are being used is paddling, restraints, seclusion, or how the rules are in the facility, you want to really look carefully at that.
Absolutely. I think the other big red flag is, are they doing anything confrontational or humiliating? Right. You want to find out, what do they do for discipline? Mm-hmm. If they do for discipline anything that sounds iffy, if it's having kids discipline each other, if it is, corporal punishment of any kind, if there's a point and level system, a lot of programs still have those things, even though there's no evidence that this helps anybody. Right. So, the reality is everybody can have a bad day. And so the idea that, you lose all your levels because you freak out one day is ridiculous. Mm-hmm. If you were dieting and you ate a chocolate bar one day, you don't instantly gain all the weight back, and you don't, but unfortunately, in the addictions world, if you relapse one day, you're supposed to have lost all your sober time, and I think that's a flaw in the addictions world. That should not be the case. They're not going to listen to me, but what I would say for that is that you get 90 days again, and you get your old time back. But anyway, but yes, I think being aware of seclusion and restraint policies is very important, and no school should be using seclusion and restraint.
Agreed. And one other thing that I wanted to mention is, if they say to you, well, we need to tear your child down to build them up, why do we need to do that? That is not, to me, a method that is helpful, right?
Well, that is basically a recipe for PTSD, depression, addictions, anxiety disorders. Really what you're doing is you're putting extreme stress on somebody. And extreme stress that is especially related to your social status is really bad for your health. We've seen early childhood stuff. We know that if you are abused, neglected, lose your parents, have any kind of, repeated trauma, that your risks for every single health issue, with the exception of certain cancers, go up dramatically. So, whether it's heart disease, diabetes, addictions, obesity, depression, all of these things are the risk for trauma increases the risk for all of these things. So traumatizing a child is basically harming their health, both mental and physical. And I think it's really important to know that, obviously we're going to have stress in our lives and we need to deal with stress, but the kind of stress that is toxic is uncontrollable, unmanageable stress where you feel powerless. And programs basically put you into that position because they think it's going to help you. And in fact, that is a recipe for harm.
Yeah, which, brings up losing one's self-identity and conforming to the program think. And being a survivor, for me, that was huge because trusting myself to make the right decisions, to make the right call is very difficult. So bringing us to the fact that a child, Nick was telling us yesterday, that a child is developing,
Yes.
developing their frontal lobe. And what did you say, Nick?
What was I saying specifically?
Yeah, about the development of a child's frontal lobe, right?
I can probably answer that.
Thank you.
The prefrontal cortex, which is the
That's-
seat of.
You know what, I remember what I was saying. So,
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Nick.
So the question is, when you're going through your formative years, 13, 14, 15, 16, your prefrontal cortex is being developed. Lifton did a ton of research on adults who were subjected to it and how it affected them later on in life. Now, let's think about how, this type of behavior happening on kids during their most precious teens during their most precious years. Now, how would that affect them later on? And is it more severe? And how,
Well, we know that early experiences are critical in lifelong health. And adolescence and the 0 to 3 in adolescence, you see massive changes in the brain that you don't see at any other time in life. So, if you avoid horrible trauma at 0 to 3, and then you create it at, 13 to 23, you're causing problems. I mean, the younger you are, the more vulnerable you are. And, the way the brain develops is dependent on how you use it. So the more stress you have, the more you get adapted to a highly stressful situation, and the more difficult it becomes for you to say, sit still in a calm situation. So yeah, these years are crucial. Seems to be an issue with this microphone. Sorry about that. Okay, yeah, that sounds, there must be a short somewhere. Anyway, so the teenage years are a crucial part of development. I think, one of the interesting things about addiction is that if you don't become addicted to something before you're 21, your odds of becoming addicted to anything are really, really low. It goes from like 1 in 4 down to like 3%. So, whether that's because during adolescence you're learning critical coping skills that frame the rest of your life, or because during adolescence you are developing your prefrontal cortex, which frames the rest of your life, those could be synonymous, actually. But we don't really know what role the social and the biological play, but we do know that this is a very important developmental period, and that, doing harm at this time can cause lifelong harm.
Which brings me to my next question, which is, what are the long-term effects or impacts of this type of treatment on an adult?
Well, even a kid who is treated in their teens.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is breaking up. Another one? Actually, I can just use yours. Okay, yeah, that'll work. So, yes, all of the effects I just spoke about in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder, greater risk of any. Look at me.
Go ahead. How about now?
Okay, yeah, here we go. All right. So we good? Okay, cool. One of these things. All right, all right. So yeah, so I mean, I think all of the things that that we were just talking about, post-traumatic stress disorder, addictions, obesity, heart disease, diabetes, all of those things are, and any psychiatric disorder, whether it's schizophrenia or if you have a predisposition to it, extreme stress is what's going to bring it out. So putting your child under extreme uncontrollable stress is bad for them, to put it in, plain English. It just, any kind of harm it pretty much can do.
Yeah. We're going to switch microphones off. Nick, did you want to say something?
I was talking a little about repetitive compulsion the other day,
Uh-huh.
and how like those specific things that we experience through the adult form ideological pluralism, how that specifically could affect someone later on in their life. Becoming either the abuser or becoming.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, yes.
The victim over and over again, even later on in life.
Yeah.
Whether you're under extreme stress, just from maybe you're in a fight with a family member or something that's going on, going on at work.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are formative years in terms of your relationships, and if you are taught that, confronting and attacking people is helpful to them, then you may behave very in a way that is perceived by normal people as antisocial. And so yes, and I think what does happen when you are traumatized is that stress can trigger a return to the behavior of that time. So yeah, so if you get in a fight with your partner or your boss, and that triggers that stuff, you may behave in a totally inappropriate way, and that could be dangerous to your career or your relationship. You have a question?
I was just waiting to finish. Is there a percentage of misdiagnosis as opposed to like with the say the children going into these facilities? How you gave the example for addiction,
Asperger's, yeah. Well, the thing is that the only diagnosis you need to get into these programs is what I call a wallet biopsy. Does your parent have enough money to pay for it?
I love that.
I did not make that up. I've heard that from a doctor somewhere, but I just thought it was like the perfect phrase. Maybe Phil gave it to me. But I think it basically describes how they figure out whether or not you have a problem. So because also these places, some of them are actually explicitly opposed to psychiatry, and some of them pretend to be therapy. So there's kind of all kinds of stuff mixed together here. And are there misdiagnoses? Absolutely, but it doesn't even start with a diagnosis oftentimes, so that is a real problem. And you do get kids who are in there who have everything from absolutely nothing wrong with them, they just pissed off their parents, to kids who, are probably psychopaths. So, it's not a good mixture.
Just go back to the
Yes.
repetitive compulsion. For me, something I've experienced with my PTSD is that there are times where I feel like I need to be back in an institution. Like I can't survive, and for no particular reason. It could just happen. I could wake up and I'm like, oh no, I need to be back in an institution. I can't be out here in public and trusting myself. The only place I'm safe is being, someone else controlling me and being restrained on the floor, which is absolutely absurd. Because, so I'm wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. I mean, I think,
Being told that,
yes.
jail, this is the only.
Yes. I see what you're getting at. I think, in these institutions, part of the process of breaking you down is making you utterly dependent on the group and making you completely grateful to them and completely vulnerable, so that you believe they are the only people that could ever help you, and that this is the only kind of thing that could ever help. And yes, that will make you feel very vulnerable when, when you feel out of sorts. And I think, I've definitely talked to lots of people who feel that way, who've been through this. So yeah, I think that's a real danger, and I think, it's just like any other kind of child abuse where, abused children can mistake abuse for love and for care, and that can get into your psyche in many, many different ways, and can be incredibly damaging. I mean, I think it's one of the worst things about this is that if you are harmed by an institution that's supposed to be helping you, it's very hard to seek appropriate help later because you're not going to trust it. And if you do need help, you're going to resist getting it because why wouldn't you? It's rational to make sure that you don't end up in that kind of situation again. And yet there will be this sort of pull towards those kinds of experiences like you were talking about, where you will, think you deserve it, think that's what's going to be the best thing for you, think that you don't deserve the good stuff in your life, and that, that's the place for you. I think all of that stuff is really damaging and powerful. And, the other thing, though, I want to say is, thankfully, we're sitting here with a group of survivors. People are resilient, and, that's not to downplay the harm that can be done, but, I'm always awed by the people here because, part of the reason I wrote the book is because I was afraid to seek help for my own addiction because I'd actually read an article about kids. I didn't realize this until retrospectively, but that was one of my key sources for what drug treatment would be like. And I knew that would kill me. I knew I wouldn't survive that. And so I just didn't seek help. And, I ended up 80 pounds and, facing a 15 to life sentence from selling coke and, covered with tracks and in terrible shape, before I would finally go to treatment. I'm a highly oversensitive person, so I just can't imagine how I could have dealt with that. One of my biggest fears is like not being able to go to the bathroom. And, it's like, but anyway, so I think, I thought deeply about that stuff because of my own stuff. And I think that it is remarkable what people can survive. And, one of the things that I think is amazing about, people who have been through this is that, you've had to face the darkest stuff and the darkest side of people, and you've come through the other side of it. And it made you, ultimately reject that kind of abuse and reject doing this kind of stuff to other people. And, ultimately, you end up being more compassionate and empathetic and kind. And obviously, I'm not recommending doing this to people in order to create kindness and empathy, because generally it creates the opposite. But I'm glad that you guys are coming together to do this, and I hope that, I can just be of help in however I can.
Thanks, Maya. One more, actually a few more. Has there been a definitive or a conclusive study on the long-term effects of thought reform brainwashing on people who have been subject to this type of abuse as children?
No, and there really needs to be. I was speaking with Phil earlier about this and Sean, I think. So I'm terrible with names. I can't believe I got that. But what did he say? So anyway, now I've completely forgot. Oh, well, there's been a study. Yes. So nobody has ever actually done a long-term follow-up of everybody who went through one of these places. And the reason everybody is important is because if you just do people who show up at meetings like this, they'll just be like, oh, those are the whiners. Those are the people, the people for whom it worked just went on and blah, blah. And, we know that that's not true. So we really need a complete sample of people who went to any particular program and just, 10 years later, 20 years later, where are they? How many people killed themselves? How many people are still addicted? How many people got worse afterwards? How many people have a PTSD diagnosis? What else do people have? So that work really, really needs to be done. And if anybody wants to do that, please get in touch with me and I'll help as much as I can. You have a question? Where did you go? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think from judging from your age, I'm guessing you were there relatively recently. Oh, right. Okay. Well, this is a compliment. You were very young looking. But anyway, the reason I was saying that is because it does tend to be the case that when people come out immediately, they tend to be very gung-ho. And so that generally tends to fade over time, but not always. I think that, one of the terrible things that these programs do is they make people think that they needed to have this done to them. And so, one of the ways to make meaning out of a horrible experience is to say, this changed me, this made me grow, this was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Saved my life.
It saved my life. And, you can understand why people say that. Like, people who've been through the Holocaust or whatever often say, I learned stuff. And, you don't want to say, like, no, you didn't, that was bad, but you certainly don't want to recommend concentration camps as a form of treatment. So, suffering is complicated, and if you make meaning out of it by saying this was good, then you may end up perpetuating other people's suffering. And that's what unfortunately happens a lot with these places. I mean, I think the parents have even more of a motivation to say that it was, or to believe that it had to be done, because, nobody wants to think, the people who are not abusive anyway, don't want to think that they hurt their kids. And so it is, it's a very complicated issue, but there's a lot of research in psychology that shows that, for example, if you pay more for something, you tend to like it more. And if I actually ran into the son of this guy the other day, but this person did research where they had to do something embarrassing, like say sexual words or something like that, in order to get into a group, and then the other people didn't have to do something embarrassing, and the group was really boring. And the ones who had the embarrassing kind of initiation were way more gung-ho about this ridiculous, boring group than the people who had none. So, there's stuff that shows why this happens. But I think it's a very important thing to be aware of, because, it does kind of make some sense. And, it also kind of helps you have some compassion, even though that's hard. For the people who do that, I mean. Yes?
I know for me as a survivor, for almost 30 years, I believed that I deserved what I got, because that's what I was told by my father. And that's what I was told by the group. So it wasn't until I had a wonderful trauma therapist about 2.5 years ago
Yes. Okay, so in the past, there was a lot of Medicaid money going to this, like, for example, Phoenix House and stuff like that was primarily, but now, a lot of the legitimate drug treatment places don't do it anymore. So a lot of these troubled teen schools are private. But some people do end up getting court mandated into it, and other people, they go before, the parents go before the judge and say, I'm going to send my kid to this place, so will you, so it interacts with the public systems that way. There are also boot camps that are part of the criminal justice system, so public money goes into those, even though we've known for a good 20 years that this actually is, it's a good way to train an army. It's not a good way to help people overcome life problems.
So the last question is, obviously, where do we go from here? How do people out there, how do we, change this? How can we do things to impact change with institutional child abuse?
I think the most important thing is to speak out. The more people get this problem known by the public, because when I talk about this stuff, and I'm sure you've had this experience more than me, but I get this feeling sometimes that people think I'm crazy, and that part of the thing.
All the time.
Well, well, there you go. But yes, but it's hard to believe that there could be lockdown institution for kids that are less regulated than nail salons and dog groomers. But that exists in the United States today. So, the more awareness we get, the better. I think regulation is a kind of double-edged sword. I favor it because I want to put some pressure on these places, but I also fear it because I don't want to legitimize them. I think that you shouldn't be able to be sent to a place for no diagnoses for a treatment that harms.
Right.
And, while it would be very difficult to create what I'd like to call an FDA for behavioral health, where you'd have to prove that, your therapy works before you can sell it to people, there's free speech issues, there's all kinds of issues that make that a very difficult thing to actually do. So the better thing to do is to have parents know that this is not helpful, and that if you have a kid in trouble, there are other things to do that are better. And one of my main goals with that book was to make this unacceptable for nice parents. Because in the past, parents didn't know. And in fact, people who were incredibly liberal and kind, and people I'm thinking of like Sally Bacon, who were just, really concerned kinds of parents, they thought not doing it would be harming their child. You're told if you have an addicted kid, you're often told if you don't do tough love, you're killing them. And, there's never been any data that supports that. But we sort of, in addictions and in behavioral health in general, kind of this non-medical, non-scientific tradition based on anecdote grew up. And it's very common. And so people think they're an expert because they got 90 days off drugs. And that's not true. I'm not a brain cancer expert because I got 90 days with my tumor out, and similarly, I'm not an addiction expert because I have, 90 days off of drugs. And, I am an addiction expert now, but that's not because I'm a former addict. It's because I've studied my butt off to learn about this stuff.
Question.
Yes.
In these programs in AA, they say, if you have an addiction or had an addiction, you never drink or do anything ever again. But there have been studies
I can speak to that, yes. The reality is that, you cannot, I mean, most children who are sent to these places would not qualify for a DSM-4 diagnosis of what was then called substance dependence. So, we cannot predict which college drinker who's 40% of college students binge drink. We cannot predict which one of those will be a lifelong alcoholic and which one of those will just, oh gosh, I have a job now and a kid, I gotta moderate. So yes, it is true that some people can safely drink and use again, absolutely. The research shows that the sort of vast majority of people who have drug problems in their teens and 20s outgrow them with no treatment whatsoever. Now, this is not to say that if you're successfully, happily sober, that it's necessarily a good idea to mess around with this stuff. But if you feel like you were misdiagnosed, there certainly is evidence to support the fact that you might be able to do stuff safely. But again, you really want to think very hard before doing that. And I will speak personally here. I do drink alcohol now after years of not doing it. I'm horrible. So far as I can tell, I have yet to become an alcoholic. But I am very careful because I know that, I was not a moderate heroin or cocaine user. Shooting up 40 times a day kind of makes it impossible to make a claim of moderation there. And, I have had opiates for dental pain maybe 15 years ago, and if I needed an opiate again, I surely would take it, but I would be very careful, because I know that I love those drugs and it would be a bad idea. I would certainly never take one recreationally, although I reserve the right to do so when I'm 90. Exactly. I think, actually, my secret plan for drug prevention is to have, all the 80 and 90-year-olds be doing, coke and heroin, because everybody else would be like, oh, this is utterly uncool. You had a question. No, you in the pink shirt. Oh, I thought you had a question. Oh, okay. Sure. There's actually no evidence that there is an addictive personality. The reason we think there is because there certainly are people with addictions who fit a particular stereotype. But, they actually say in the autism world, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And the same may be said for addictions. There are certainly personality traits that increase risk. But everybody with addiction doesn't have those traits, and everybody with those traits doesn't have addiction. So, for example, I have sort of OCD-ish traits, and those definitely increase your risk. But, there's people whose addictions are primarily impulsive, and I'm not especially impulsive. So again, there is so this idea of a dry drunk comes straight from 12-step programs, and the idea is that the only way to recover is by doing the 12 steps of AA, and that if you recover by any other means, you are a dry drunk. Or you can even be a dry drunk if you're in AA if you're not pleasing the people who are saying that about you. I think that's a very silly designation. On the other hand, there is a tiny kernel of truth in the fact that when you are addicted and you are not paying attention to, your psychological health, you might be veering into old behavior that is problematic, and so you might want to look at that. But the idea that all people with addiction are the same, or that you can't be in recovery without being in 12-step groups is just not true.
So right now, what I like to do is just to have an open kind of dialogue like we're doing. Alexander, did you have a question?
I wanted to ask, when you talked about regulation,
Yes.
but why
I would not disagree with that. I just think that in terms of the way our political structure is, um, having kids have the absolute right to do what they want at any time, basically, people would object to. I'm not saying that that is, I think that before you are locked up anywhere, any human being should have a right to a court hearing or, some kind of determinant that they generally need to be in that setting. I don't think it is appropriate for parents to be able to send their kid to, some place that locks them up just because they want to. On the other hand, parents do send their kids to boarding schools all the time, and you could probably make a good case that, well, those ones in England are pretty abusive. I mean, I think they're better now, but they used to beat them until very recently.
Yeah, mine was a boarding school. It was called a boarding school.
Right, right. I mean, but like, say, Andover and Exeter are probably reasonably safe. Brearley, or that's not even a boarding school. But anyway, should parents have their right to send their kid to a legitimate boarding school? That's not a debate I feel like getting into.
Right.
I would prefer to work on things I can win. So I would prefer to have, things like not allowing people to be beaten and people to have absolute access to the outside world via the internet or phone. Because I think if you allow people to talk to the outside world, a lot of this stuff cannot occur.
Phil? I feel like I need to.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we should have the microphone passed around, because if there are people watching on the thing, it might be very frustrating.
I sort of want to speak to two related things. The question, Jody, that you asked Maia about what the signs are or how you know that a program is abusive, because I've long felt that that list should be as short as possible. The shorter you could make that list, the better.
Yes.
And the second was the point that led me to want to say something, was the point that Maia made about the DSM when she said it's easy to criticize, but it's the best thing we have, which is really an important point, because it really is easy to criticize. But without it, it would really be the Wild West. And I want to relate those two things to another thing and try to bring it all together, which is, as I think about this group and the SIA group coming together, and I think about how incredibly important it is for the people that have been in the straight kids group of programs and the other group of programs like you were in, Jody. But it's very important that if we want to be helpful going forward, and it's very important because it's therapeutic for people that are there. It's good for me, having seen the kids thing, to every once in a while come back to that piece of my life.
Yeah.
It's been nice, it's been good for me to be around people that have been into this weekend. But it's very important that we focus, if we want to be helpful going forward, on what's going on now and not where it's been, and focus on what's changed. And so in order to help kids in terms of where we are now, the two things that I think would make a difference, and it doesn't need to be more than two things, is one, the communication thing. Kids need to be, if you allow kids to be in touch with their parents, you eliminate an enormous part of the problem. The truth is that the reason for not allowing communications is not anything to do with the kids. It's because it's therapeutic for parents to not speak to their kids for a period of time, because it gives them a respite from having a difficult kid in their house. They think their kid's in a safe place. They're not talking to them. They're not listening to their kid complain. They're happier. And everybody on Nick's panel spoke to that. The second is a question about diagnosis. Kids are sent off as troubled teens, whatever you call it, yet these programs now, particularly in their effort to get funding for what they're doing from people other than parents, particularly since the recession and the collapse of the real estate market, Now the effort is to get others to pay for it, whether it's through educational IEPs, or through, back again through health insurance. You would make an enormous change if you simply said that any kid that was sent away had to have a diagnosis signed off on by a licensed professional that said, this is what's wrong with the kid.
An independent person.
Yeah, but you know what? Even if it was associated with the program, they'd have a tough time finding it if they then had to have a treatment program. And then at the end, you could measure how they did at treating the thing they claimed
Well,
they were treated. They have,
yeah.
So those two things,
Yeah.
the requirement, preferably obviously by an independent person, of a diagnosis associated with using the DSM, and communication. It ends. It ends. They couldn't exist if those two things were required. They've been allowed to simply say, we treat all these things, then have parents sign contracts which specifically say, we don't treat anything in particular, and then treat kids as, quote, troubled teens altogether. The Survived by Kidnapped for Christ movie, what I really liked about that movie was that it focused on 3 kids. And the 3 kids, have you seen it, Maya? Yeah, okay. Okay.
I was hoping somebody can give me a screener here, if
Okay.
there's anybody who can.
So the nice thing about the movie, and I don't even know if it was intentional for me, was it focuses on 3 kids. And the one kid is sent there presumably because his parents didn't want him to be gay. The second kid clearly has, a young woman clearly has a psychiatric illnesses, probably appropriately treated by medication. And the third young woman is somebody who appears to be out of control, whether because of trauma she experienced as a kid, or just because that she was out of control. I don't pretend to know the reason. And the idea that those 3 kids, with 3 totally separate sets of issues, were all going to be treated in exactly the same way in the same program is preposterous. Preposterous. And so if they had to, for each one of those kids, say what was wrong with them and say what they're doing for that kid, the programs couldn't exist. So those are my thoughts, and I think it matters going forward because there's a serious attempt now, as big money has entered the industry through the Aspen crowd. There's a serious attempt now for them to gain credibility and move into the mental health field, along with other public residential programs, and try to position themselves as the charter schools of mental health for adolescents. That's what's happening. That's what's going to happen next. They're going to try to say the public institutions are too expensive and this, and we can help these kids in a private setting for less public money. So give public money to private institutions to send kids away. I really believe, I sincerely believe that's where this is headed.
It's interesting, though, because Aspen does seem to be closing down a lot of their troubled teenish places. And they also, they're part of that network that does own some legitimate drug treatment places. And here's the really weird thing. The woman who now heads Aspen is married to Tom McClellan, the the guy who was a former deputy drug czar, who was actually a leading addiction researcher and has previously been a good guy. I just think that.
If that's true, we need to know that and recognize and not call them bad names.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know if, I don't know, they're not all closed, for one. Yes, yes.
And there's a tendency that we have to treat everything, to assume that what this monstrous thing that was experienced
Yes.
by people that are here is exactly the same thing that's going on for kids now. And to a significant extent, that's not true. It's different,
Yeah.
and I don't know. Honestly, I don't have enough information to know, and it's wonderful to hear you say what you just said. 'Cause
Yeah, I mean,
maybe
I
it is-
want to see
maybe
what
it is
actually.
getting better.
Yeah, I want to see what actually happens. But I mean, the good news in general is that a heck of a lot of places have closed. I mean, Elan is gone. WASP seems to be gone. It may come back, but I don't, it's hard to imagine that it could get anywhere as big as it was. Aspen did close at least 5 or 6 places. Academy at Swift River is one of them that's gone. I don't even know if Aspen has any therapeutic boarding schools anymore. Because I think the only 2 they had were Academy at Swift River and lovely Mount Bachelor Academy, AKA the lap dance school. I mean, it's astonishing that people were able to get away with this in the 21st century. And I mean, it really is thanks to people, here that we know that that's absurd and that it's damaging and that, we need to, continue to make sure that this doesn't, we had like, let's be mean to them in the woods, let's be mean to them military style, let's be mean to them in a boarding school. We just want to be sure that it doesn't resurface, let's be mean to them in space. I don't know. We need to make sure that it doesn't resurface somewhere else.
Well, just 2 things. First thing is MISIC diagnosis. Well, there's several documentaries on diagnosis. I myself personally was diagnosed as being a schizophrenic as a child, and that followed me and carried me all the way until I was 18 years old. And I am not a schizophrenic. So somebody said I was. Somebody said I was, and they wrote it on paper. And they wrote it on paper, and so I carried through till I was 18 years old. And so it's really important, I guess. Okay. So it's really important that we make sure, I guess as parents, I'm a parent, that if something is going on with our child, that we seek a reputable person to diagnose and treat if that is needed.
Can we use the other microphone? Yeah. I mean, I think like it's unfortunately there's been a change in DSM-5 which makes it a lot easier to diagnose a substance use disorder, because there used to be 2 separate diagnoses. There was substance abuse and substance dependence, both of which were terrible and ridiculous names. But now there's one substance use disorder, and they've gotten rid of those annoying terms. But it could be mild, moderate, or severe. So the problem with that is basically if you have mild substance use disorder, that's basically mild addiction. And it implies, at least to the untrained brain and to, the layperson, that, right, but it implies that you are now, at your college binge drinker, 40% of the college population has the disease of addiction, which is a bad thing to do. You don't want that on your medical records, and it would be very easy to label any child with it. So I think I like the idea of requiring an independent assessment before a kid gets sent, but and requiring that a person needs to be treated for a specific diagnosis, yes, but it's easy to fake diagnosis is the problem.
So I just want to thank you so much for coming, and like I said, I follow you on Twitter, and I really appreciate this conference and everything that's been said. And I guess I also want to offer like not an alternative position, but just to clarify some things that I've been feeling in the audience as a person who does carry a diagnosis of bipolar 2 and does hear and see things. I run the blog Fuck Yeah Mad Pride, and I'm really passionate about that, and it's a part of the larger disability pride movement, and I think it's something that we should all take up really passionately. And so I know when I'm hearing you use the word psychopath, that you're using it because we're in an insider space. But for those who are watching online, that's not a word that everybody gets to use. Like, you and I might get to use that. I might get to use that because I do carry, I've had psychotic experiences or whatever. But I think, it is important to be clear about, because these audiences are so different. And so I just wanted to kind of, not
Sure.
take issue with that. But
No,
I know
no,
that you're using insider language, and I want
Yes.
everybody else to know that they don't get to say that. We get to say that. And I also want to say that the DSM, I definitely recognize how important it is. And I'm also a part of a movement that like really hates it or whatever. And I want to say that I think it's important, not because of all the pathologizing necessarily, but because of poverty and insurance. The DSM enables people to use insurance to have, right, cheaper care, which everyone deserves. And so it's structurally important more so than ideologically. And that's it. And thank you so much
Oh,
for
thank
letting
you.
me say that.
I am a big fan of the Mad Pride and neurodiversity movements, and yeah, and also I want to make a distinction because psychopath, but yeah, also because psychopath and psychotic are not the same, and I do think maybe I should have used sociopath, but I'm talking when I'm using that language, I'm talking specifically about the extreme of antisocial personality disorder, like the Hare psychopathy checklist, which is kind of insider language, I guess. But but what I am not meaning people who have psychotic experiences at all, and I am meaning people who have, and it's an interesting question actually. If you think about antisocial personality disorder, like, do we want to say that's a disease and then say that like some people who are really evil, like, will they have a disease too? It's just that makes them evil. And and I would never characterize bipolar or schizophrenia or any kind of psychotic disorder or anything in that same ballpark. But I don't know what we do with antisocial personality disorder, because there are clearly some genetic pieces to that, and there's clearly some environmental pieces to that those people did not choose. So that's a real complicated issue. Phil. Yes. A classic example of that. You need to read my next book.
I read your last book, and I will read your next.
But
I promise. But that combining of the two has done a terrible. I think it's been a very bad thing.
I mean,
Because the whole idea, this whole world of people that treat behavioral health has led, I think, to all kinds of trouble, including me.
I am not convinced on that. My feeling generally is that.
And you'll have to read mine.
There you go. The addictions field basically was segregated from the rest of medicine because addicts are evil and bad, and because of racism. And even though, of course, we know that minority groups have no higher rates of addiction than anybody else. But that segregation led to a substandard system of care for people with addiction. And behavioral health is just a term that the insurance industry, I think, came up with that encompasses um, mental illness and addictions, which mental illnesses and addictions should never have been separated, because addiction is simply, I see it as a developmental disorder, and that's what this book is actually about. But the thing that's important to keep in mind is that it is a learned behavior that gets out of control. And the physical dependence actually doesn't matter. Cocaine doesn't cause physical dependence. And I would dare you to argue that cocaine is not addictive. Because they used to, in fact, I was writing about this recently, but in fact, in 1980, Scientific American said that snorted cocaine is not addictive because it doesn't produce physical dependence. Um, and they said actually it's no more addictive than potato chips. And the funny thing is, of course, now we say potato chips, they're as addictive as cocaine. But the point is that addiction has been separated from other forms of compulsive behavior because addiction was believed to be especially pleasurable. And I would argue, as a person who has OCD-ish stuff and addictions, that both of them are generally about relieving anxiety, at least in my instance. They're not, it is not that I want excess pleasure, it is that I want to feel okay. A compulsive behavior may relieve my anxiety, just the way taking a drug may relieve my anxiety, but it doesn't, they're not different. Like, people used to think that OCD, because people don't like doing their OCD-ish behaviors and they think they're kind of weird, that was different to addiction because people like taking their drugs. But in fact, when you're really addicted, the drugs aren't working anymore. So you're not liking it that either. And maybe it relieves anxiety and maybe it doesn't. But so I think it is appropriate to consider addiction a developmental disorder along the neurodiversity spectrum somewhere. And that term neurodiversity sort of comes from the autism field, and the idea is that we're all wired differently, and we should sort of celebrate different wirings, and some of them may be associated with disabilities, but those disabilities don't necessarily define the whole person, and they can also be accompanied by abilities and by a lot of different strengths. And so we need to, I think putting that all together is actually useful. Yes. 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 No, I think those Asian things are terrifying, and we do have one so-called internet addiction treatment center in the United States. I think that addiction is a compulsive pattern of behavior that continues despite negative consequences. And in that sense, you can develop a technology addiction or whatever you would want to call it. So the problem with all of this is that all of this stuff is deeply culturally determined. So if I am, if I'm, say, a heroin addict with a rich girlfriend and a supply that is infinite and pure, and my girlfriend doesn't mind, I'm not having negative consequences, I'm enjoying myself, presumably, and, I'm not obsessed about getting my supply since I have my supply. So is that an addiction? So it's a really weird, it becomes a really strange question. With the internet use, like, let's say I'm using the internet 24/7 and I'm making $1 billion and my family is totally happy with me just spending all that time in front of the computer and I'm happy. So is that an addiction? I can certainly see it being an addiction if you are pissing off everybody around you, not eating, not sleeping, being on the net all the time, and having all kinds of negative consequences. But because the culture is the determinant of what those negative consequences are going to be, and because that's going to relate to race and class and all this other crap, it's going to get complicated. So, why I see addiction in part as a learning disorder is because you need to learn the problem. Like, I cannot, you can't make me into an addict. Contrary to popular belief, doctors can't make people into addicts because, I could make you physically dependent on heroin, and you might hate every second of it. Like about 15% of people just hate opiates. They just don't like the feeling. So the moment I liberated you, if you were in that 15% of people, you'd be like, ugh, you might feel like you had the flu for a couple days, but you'd just be, over it. In order to be an addict, you'd have to be like, oh, I like that, I want more, and go find a dealer. It requires some degree of choice, and the early choices are less constrained than the later choices. And I don't mean this to say that it's a moral issue so much as that it involves voluntary behavior at first, and this then changes over time. Depression requires voluntary behavior at first too, because you have to like sort of hate yourself and think all kinds of bad things, and then that can wear a groove into your brain that makes you depressed. Now, you could also just have bad chemistry that wears that same groove in also. But the point is just that this is why behavioral health is really complicated, because learned behavior takes place in the context of your culture, that you can't just take that out. And I mean, the famous rat park experiment where they took these rats and they gave some of them just your typical bear cage, and they gave some of them basically rat paradise with, rat girlfriends and boyfriends and toys and lots of yummy food and all this. So the rats in rat paradise they would not take the morphine that was allowed, that was in their water. They did not want it. Whereas the ones in the isolated cage, they were like, yeah, give me that. So obviously social conditions matter. We're a social species. Yes.
I was just going to say, I do believe you could breed an addict. Like when we were in kids, we were under severe trauma. And I feel most addicts, they use because they're trying to get away from something.
Yes.
And you couple that with being in this complete controlled environment, and the meme that you're the worst of the worst addict, and the only place out of here for you is jail, institution, or death, and that being drilled into you so many times on a subconscious level, coupled with the trauma, makes things very confusing. And I've spoken to so many people and that went in without a drug addiction, and maybe people who used but perhaps weren't addicts, but came out of it because of this, the constant, the trauma and the constant drilling, and then at a certain point on the subconscious level.
Let me say one thing.
Yes.
I meant that you can't create an addict by giving person drugs.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to make a point.
No, and I mean, I think that's a very valid point. I think, if we wanted to create an addict, we would just abuse, neglect, starve, do all of the things that are done in kids, and we'd have a pretty good chance of creating one.
But on top, in addition to that, yeah, the intense trauma, but being drilled constantly.
Yes.
This is the only information that you're receiving,
Yes.
and you're lying. You're the worst of the worst of the worst of the worst. You're an addict. So I think putting all that together.
I completely agree that will dramatically increase your odds of becoming an addict afterwards. There's absolutely no doubt about that. When I was talking about the, there's this idea that you go for pain treatment and a doctor gives you opiates, and then that just automatically turns you into an addict via exposure. And, we know that about maybe 1 to 3% of people with no prior history of addiction who get pain treatment become addicted. So that leaves the other 97%. So that, that was the point I was trying to make. I mean, obviously trauma and telling people over and over and over that they're an addict is not good and probably increases the odds.
I also wanted to just mention that just because you believe that you're an addict after coming out of there, it doesn't mean that the false notion of that is true or will ever be true. You can be convinced that you're an alcoholic and an addict and brainwashed into believing that.
Yes.
But if you were never, you were never. And yes, there is trauma, but you're not an addict.
Well, right. I think this is the complexity, right? Because this is why I did not say this makes you into an addict. I said increases the odds dramatically of you becoming one. Because, let's say 1 in 10 people are normally have some issues that will be creating an addiction in them. You probably increase that by a factor of 4 when you do the kids treatment. So now you got 40%, but that still means the other 60% are not. And so I just made up those numbers. Actually, I made up those numbers based on the odds of alcoholism in the general population is roughly 10%. The odds of becoming an alcoholic, if you have 2 parents that are alcoholic, is roughly 40%. It's not 100%. And it's not even the majority. So, this is a complicated thing because addiction requires a lot of different things and a lot of learning processes, like being told over and over that you're an addict, or like learning, I take this drug, I feel better, or many other things that you can learn.
So I just want to, go ahead, Alexander.
Thank you. Phil said earlier, I think it was Phil, that the problems could be largely solved by requiring diagnoses. As a survivor of a psychiatric hospital, where they certainly had plenty of access to the DSM and plenty of expertise and so forth, and still used points and levels and still approached things from the perspective of we're here to change you according to our vision of what's best for you. I can tell you that that's simply not the case. I know there are a lot of people who think that with regulations and professionalism and heavy academic training, we can ensure that people are not subjected to things designed to break them and make them malleable. But as a psychiatric survivor, I have seen your promised land, and it runs with the same river of tears. Can we give him the second mic, because I think I'm going to want to respond.
No, from my perspective, the concept, what I was really talking about was wasn't a point at all about psychiatric help or psychiatric institutions or the utilization of the DSM in psychiatric institutions. I wasn't speaking to that at all. I was really talking about something very different, which had to do with the number of kids that are sent away that have no mental health issue of any significance at all, no psychiatric illness of any issue at all, who would not be sent away and who would not be taken in by these places if these places were required to actually give the kid a diagnosis. The fact that they don't have to provide a diagnosis is what has allowed them, to a significant extent, to con parents. And that was really the only point I was trying to make. I wasn't trying to get into a discussion of the appropriate treatment in psychiatric institutions or the utilization of diagnosis in psychiatric institutions, which is not all part of the same question. What I was talking about is all the kids I've met who never should have been part of the system, never should have been in any sort of an institutional setting at all. And that was the only point I was trying to make.
Okay, well, certainly there are people who are subjected to these things who don't have diagnoses, and they could be protected if you insisted on, well, some of them could be protected if you insisted on diagnoses. But I think people who do have diagnoses deserve protection as well.
I wouldn't argue the other side of that.
Hopefully we will soon get a better diagnostic system. There are definitely people looking at that and, trying to, right now it's got 10 zillion dimensions and it won't be at all clinically useful, but I think the fact that the NIMH is not funding research based on DSM diagnoses anymore is a good thing. They are doing cross-cutting work, and there's this whole thing called research domain criteria, which, again, that's the one that's really complicated, but an attempt to get rid of all the comorbidity and try to figure out so that we're not treating these, so that every time I interview somebody, they don't have to tell me, this is a very heterogeneous condition, and I can't really say anything about it because of that. So anyway, thank you so much.
So I wanted to say that there is a difference, I think, between the private sector and the public sector. And I also wanted to state myself, I was sent to a psychiatric hospital, and I didn't need that, you know, and they gave me that diagnosis. So there is possibility for flaw there as well. And, you know, they wanted the insurance money. And when the insurance money ran out from my parents, I was magically cured and have a good day, you know. And so there is definitely problems there. But, you know, I mean, and that's why we're here. We're here to discuss, to strategize, to see, you know, what can we do to make that big difference. And I just want to say thank you so much, Maia, for coming out and speaking with us and sharing your thoughts. And it's been just a really good time of discussion and reflection. And I want to also say that on the SIA-Now website and also on the SIA-Convention website, there's resources, there's links to Maia's works, there's information there, and you can, you know, volunteer. You can sign up to, you know, work with social media or volunteer in person. I mean, there's a lot of things that can be done. There's been significant changes in the industry, yes, but there's a lot of work to do. And so even though there's been significant changes and success, you know, the reason for that is because of things like this, and for speaking out and making it known that this is, you know, not something that is appreciated nor tolerated. And so doing whatever we can to make that difference and encourage that change is very, very important and crucial. And I just want to thank everybody for coming in. And if we can just break for 10 minutes and come back, I have something for the speakers I just want to present. And then we'll move into the memorial and close the convention. So 10-minute break and then come back. Okay, thanks. So I'm sorry. Maya reminded me that we need to eat. That's important. So let's break for a lunch for an hour and come back, and then we'll go ahead into you know, the awards and break and memorial service. Okay, thanks, guys. An hour break for lunch.
Okay, so wait. Actually, we have another slight change of plans.
So, guys, quickly, you know, I want to thank the speakers that have come to the convention. You know, without their, you know, sacrifice and hard work and coming out, something like this is not possible, and raising that awareness is not possible. And so I just want to extend SIA's appreciation for them to continue to support, raise that awareness, and for coming out this weekend. And so I want to present Maia, let me see, Maia with this award, thanking her for coming out and speaking and sharing with us today. Thank you so much, Maia.
I am delighted and honored to accept this, and I really appreciate it. This is an area where you don't really get much appreciation, so thank you again.
Oh, Maya, this is for you as well. Yes. Yes, please.
Good, good. I'm glad. So the next person that I want to bring up here is Phil Elberg. Thank you so much, Phil. So Phil is like, an amazing man, and he has, I just met him this weekend, and a friend for life. Thank you so much for doing what you do.
Listen, those of you who know me know how much this has meant to me. So thank you all very much. Thank you.
This next award, gentlemen, I don't know if I can get through this without crying, but he has been so much to me. He spoke at the very first convention, and he believed in SIA from the very jump. And I said, "Hey, can you come out? Can we show your?" He's like, "Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I'm here. I'm doing it." And he has since done so much and so much into my life. See, I cry. But his activism, his film work, his hustle, his just dedication and spirit, you have my heart. And I just want to present you this.
Receiving these, thank you, first of all, but receiving these, it really feels here selfish because you do so much and you're selfless. And then on top of that, you're giving us these things, which I'm incredibly grateful for. But you deserve the biggest one out of them all. And I wish I had something to give you right now, but it's been an incredible journey, and you inspire me. I can't tell you how much you inspire me, and really how much everyone here inspires me. You come out. It's difficult facing this stuff. It's difficult talking about it in public. It's difficult talking about it in private. I mean, at this point, if I go on a job interview to direct a commercial, it always comes up because it's on my resume. And it's like, oh, well, tell me about this. Yeah, it's like, oh yeah, So then I was being restrained, and then it's like, okay, so then I got the anal probe. Okay, yeah, nice meeting you too. Then I have, as I talked about on, I guess I'll repeat. I don't think I told this to Maya. Everyone else heard this, but I have to. This is exclusively for Maya right now. Let's see here. My sound mixer on my last feature. He's an Emmy winner. He calls me one day and he says, "Can you endorse me on LinkedIn?" And at that point, I've heard of LinkedIn, but I didn't really know what it was about. And I figured it out. I joined just to endorse him. And then I'm waiting around. I'm like, I wonder when someone's going to endorse me. And then after 6 months, finally someone endorsed me. And this is what they wrote, and I was incredibly flattered. Nick is extremely creative, knowledgeable, and hardworking. He's capable of handling projects of any scope. He is wonderful as a manager, showing confidence and never hesitating when it comes to making decisions. At the same time, he always treats the other members of his team in a supportive, uplifting manner. Nick would be an asset to any project. I heartily recommend him. Love, Mom. So I finally got my, so I got, yeah, I was being restrained, but I have a referral. It's my mom. She thinks the world of me.
Okay, Nick, I never endorse anybody on LinkedIn, but I will go endorse you.
I have a pity. I have a pity endorsement. Now I'll have 2 endorsements. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Maya, for placating me up here. I also have to again give a mention to Steve. He's there. The tireless effort. I have to thank Maya. Thank you so much for all you do. As you know, same to Phil and everyone else who spoke. And I really have to give a special shout out to George, because I met George. I like to call him Jorge because I love the word. I met him 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, a buddy of mine, one of my best friends. Anyway, I wound up sometimes you do these meet and greets. He really talented musician and sound guy, and I'm in town, and they're like, come by the studio. We want to show you what we do, and it was just about that. And then it was that one meeting where we must have been there for 45 minutes, and I went from that, never knowing this guy, to I think I posted something on Facebook that I'm speaking at the convention, and he said, I read a little bit about what I saw your film over the GW. You're speaking at the Survivors of Institutional Abuse Convention. I want to help out, period. He's not getting, people here, they're not getting paid, but especially this guy, we don't even know him, and he's here, and he's like, this is important. I'm there. And he's been so dedicated this whole weekend, and you're my brother, man. I love you. And your whole team. Your whole team. Dante and Poet. That's right. So, thank you all. Thank you, Jody.
So, all the crew, I have certificates for you I'm going to give to you. It takes a lot of work and effort to put something like this on, and, I couldn't do any of what I do without the people who volunteer and say, I call them up and say, hey, can you do such and such? And the response is, yeah, where do you need me? When can I do it? And, it's people with that dedicated spirit and the willingness to make that change that makes anything like this possible. And of course, I must mention the sponsors. They're on the banner. Zombie Blast, for dedicating a part of the proceeds of the sale of the Zombie Blast. You see the beautiful banner behind me. That's Anaheim Signs, made all the signage. And Gotham Comedy Club for the fundraiser, the beautiful room and the comedians, and Blondie Sports Bar and Grill, who gave us the back room. I mean, just gave it. No questions asked, just gave it and said, here, let me help. How can I help? And so great. My experience in New York has been, and I've heard some horror stories, but my personal experience has been with New York is, how can I help? Yeah, what do you need? And so I just really thank New York, and I, for letting us come out here and do all this and making this possible, because you do this on a minimal budget, and it's just been great, the stuff that we've been able to accomplish out here. And Jorge, you're amazing. Yeah. Yeah, and I want Stevie to come up here. I want you to actually come up here on stage and get a hug and a thank you, because you're just amazing, of course. And by the way, Steve is the one that said, let's do New York. And I'm like, well, I don't know. And he's like, no, we need to do New York. And so that's why we're here, you know. So
Thank you. You know, the, the key to being motivated is being around people who inspire you and who motivate you. And from the first second I met you, you were one of those people. We met at a business chamber event that was focused on technology, and you were at Brooks College at the time, and I had my comedy club on the Queen Mary. And I was like, that's a beautiful woman on the inside and on the outside. But the inside was incredible, and I didn't even know about your past. It's like,
I cry. But his activism, his film work, his hustle, his just dedication and spirit, you have my heart. And I just want...
we got two Jodies. How'd you do that? And we need two Jodies. Just like that, she cloned herself right out of the blue. Now we're going to get twice the work done. Wow. That's awesome. But I just thought, there's so much love and good in the world, but there's so much contamination and there's so much septic pool, evil, just rottenness. So to run across someone like you who can create some purity, and combine that with the love and pull together people that are cut from that same cloth, that are the same feather on that bird, is awesome. I mean, everyone in this room I met because of you, and this is some solid gold people. Everybody here is like, like no one can say squat to me because I know good people. No one can say anything about me or to me because, number one, I'm a comedian, and the comic always gets the last laugh. So say what you want. But as soon as I get the microphone, when you in the front row, I get last licks. But secondly, it's like because I know people like you and Maya and now Phil and Jorge and Addie and just everybody, I feel like I have this army behind me of righteous, good, warm, loving people that transcends all. And I want to say thank you for letting me being on your team. And, it's been just an incredible ride, and I'm willing to take it for the lifelong. And what we did in Times Square yesterday with Addie and Jorge was so much fun. And, all I can say is I can't wait till we cut that and put it up because we met people from all walks of life. And Jorge on the street is just tenacious. He's like the Tasmanian devil for street TV. He was going up to people 3 times his size, putting them in a chokehold, going, you better take the kids are getting abused in this institution, so take the flyer. Otherwise, I'm going to put you in a sleeper hole. He'd be like, I'll take the flyer. Just get off my back. I'll take the flyer. He is so awesome, man. And we had so much fun. But, to be serious, I love you. I'm here to support you. And I want to do my part in trying to populate the types of people that are here so that you have an army to do what you do. And more people need to hear Maya. More people need to hear Phil. More people need to hear Julie and Addie's story. More people need to hear and see Nick's films. And you're the catapult for that. So, yeah, see ya. But, it's like, hey, look, here's how I look at it. A Ferrari sitting in the driveway with no driver, it's cool. But until someone gets in it, turns the key on, puts the foot on, and grabs the wheel and be like, we going this direction, then it's like, okay, we're going to go with you. And it'll be cool to see a Ferrari hooked up with a trailer with me on the back of it. going. I'm following Jody here. So yes, the organization and we the people, and it takes a team, and there's no I in team and all that. I get that, but we got to have someone with vision and passion, and that's you. And you have to put your butt in that Ferrari, and put your foot on the pedal, grab the wheel, and just hit it, and we'll have you back.
So with that, we're going to, next year, I'm announcing that we're going to Los Angeles. It'll be the same time, approximately. I'll let you know the date and the location and all that. The SIA-Convention website will be updated with all of that information. But, that's home ground, home turf for myself and many that I know, and we've been networking, and it's going to be a phenomenal event. So start saving your money now. Put $2 away every week to get your plane ticket so that you can get there and get, a nice, reasonable hotel and whatnot. So start saving now for next year, this time, and we'll see you convention 2015. Yes. Oh, God. Yeah. Medically. Oh my God. Okay, so SIA Convention 2015, Los Angeles. Look at sia-convention.org for more. I love that. Yeah, Ciachella. We're going to have to do that. We need to talk. Ciachella, Ciapalooza, whatever we call it, it's going to be amazing. 2015, see you there.